I'm really enjoying that.
Yeah, that's a pretty academic piece.
Yeah.
It's very well researched and pretty fascinating.
Yeah. I think it's really fascinating about Pauli Murray, but it's also really fascinating about Eleanor Roosevelt too.
Yep.
And this aspect of her, which we know about, but don't necessarily know the details about.
Yep. No, it's yeah, Eleanor was it was kind of before my time. Sort of knew about her growing up. In med school, she was kind of she died at Columbia where I was at med school, and years before I was there. But the legend about her was that she had tuberculosis that had been widespread and is such a subtle disease that even the Columbia docs didn't recognize it in time. So that was the lesson about.
Really, that
Yeah.
and has that proven to be true over time, or do they not now?
No. It just the old term for tuberculosis is the great imitator. So I think that she was being worked up for anemia, and people hadn't realized that she had the tuberculosis spread to her bone marrow. That's what I recall after.
Interesting.
After 45 years.
Yeah. For those of you who are just joining us, we were chatting as you were coming on. We were talking about Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt, and the book that the book group is reading, the church book group is reading about the two of them. And so when David was just referring to Eleanor Roosevelt and how she died. How old was she when she died? She was.
I don't know.
70s?
She was not old by these days standards.
Yeah, true. But by those days standards, pretty much probably. Yeah. Interesting.
70s, I believe.
Someone can Google that real quick.
Yeah, we can find it out easily, but. Okay, but let us switch from that was last time David was here that we were talking about Pauli Murray, and today we're talking about Rabbi Heschel, and in particular, David's been with us previously in other years talking about Heschel. This time, particularly about one of his essays, which I hope some of you have had a chance to read. I know I read it. And some of his reflections on World War II. And David's going to be talking about how that might be helpful to us in these times, and as we think about our spirituality related to what's happening in the world. Okay.
So first of all, did anyone have a chance to read that essay?
Yeah, I read it.
Okay. All right. It's I'm glad you did, because part of the excitement of Heschel is just reading his words. It's just a beautiful writer. It's
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. As you guys know, as Mary alluded to, in September 2019, I had given 3 forums here on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and in those lectures, I hoped to introduce us to his sense of sacred humanism, his mysticism, and his activism in civil rights affairs in the 1960s. His writings are a combination of a deep and profound spiritual scholarship and a very wise perspective and analysis of the human predicament. It has been said about him that he not only reaches the minds of his readers, but also their hearts and the wills of his readers. And I found that he's not only changed my understanding of religion and spirituality, he really has changed my heart and my sense of how I relate to God and the world. And I hope I can transmit some of his analysis and also his concern for how we should be living together. And today I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. I really hope to have more of a seminar today than a lecture. And we'll be focusing on his 1943 essay, The Meaning of This War. We sent that essay out beforehand, and many of you have read it. But regardless, our discussions today should not be about what he said or what I think he said. What Rabbi Heschel says must always be and will always be subject to our interpretations, because we carry the same words in our minds, but their meaning and their significance have to relate to all the other experiences that we carry, experiences that we then have to interpret and apply for ourselves. So in discussing Rabbi Heschel, let's not assume or even consider that there is one correct interpretation. Paraphrasing what someone else has said, it's not a matter of how much Heschel we've gone through, but how much of Heschel has gone through us. And in some sense, Rabbi Heschel's worldview can only be aspirational. At the same time, I think it must always be, and it should be aspirational. As he said, the way to truth is an act of reason. The love of truth is an act of the Spirit. The way to truth is an act of reason, but the love of truth is an act of the Spirit. And Heschel reminds us, he wants us to recall that in our lives there is a spiritual dimension, an important spiritual dimension, something though that needs study and encouragement and practice. And to develop this spiritual dimension, we need to give ourselves the opportunities for that type of study, encouragement, and practice. And he also believes that without taking care of the Spirit, we can get lost in our sense of purpose, our sense of belonging, and our explanations of the world, and we can get sidetracked by the trivial and the petty. Although Rabbi Heschel speaks from a strongly Hasidic Jewish tradition, the concepts and the words should be familiar to Presbyterians. As stated in the Presbyterian Book of Order, the people of God are elected, quote, for service as well as salvation, and human nature has, quote, the tendency to idolatry and tyranny. So therefore, we must seek justice and live in obedience to the word of God, unquote. Well, not completely unquote. Heschel's religious worldview, thus, is not in opposition to Christianity, but actually, I think, helps us see how Jesus was also a Jew in the prophetic tradition. He was an intermediary, speaking for both God and for humans. So in the next 5 minutes or so, I will recap the outline of Rabbi Heschel's life, and then I'll spend another 10 or 15 minutes commenting on parts of the essay. Heschel's views and beliefs are deeply and they're very proudly Jewish, but I think we can also find them deeply important to a Christian faith system. After all, we are all part of the Abrahamic religions. Rabbi Heschel came from a long tradition, 7 generations of Hasidic rabbis in Eastern Europe. He was born in 1907 in Warsaw, Poland, and in 1927 he went west. He went 400 miles west to Berlin to study philosophy, because Berlin at that time was a center of secular Western culture. And in those years of his young adulthood, in his 20s, he encountered a corrupted and a corrupting religion that conflicted with his religious beliefs and experiences. He lived and he tried to work in Germany until he was expelled by the Gestapo in October 1938. And he was sent back to Poland because he was a Jew. He was able to get a rare visa to America in July 1939, 6 weeks before the onset of the Blitzkrieg. And as he said, he was, quote, a brand plucked from the fire in which my people was burned to death. Half of his immediate family, many friends, and the culture in which he was raised were destroyed in the Holocaust. And his subsequent life, I think, can be seen as a confrontation, his confrontation with the corruptions and shortcomings of religion that he saw in the West, and how he was teaching and showing how to live so that what he stood for might not die with his passing. And I think that when we bring him up and his teachings up, he is really still speaking to us. He came to the U.S. in 1940, and after 6 years at the liberal Reformed tradition Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Heschel went in 1946 to teach at the Conservative and Orthodox Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. And there he was a professor of ethics and mysticism until his death in 1972. He published several important religious and philosophical works on Jewish theology. He and his works were well received, probably better received among Christians than among Jews, because Rabbi Heschel was faulting the Reformed Jews for their lack of understanding of the sacred Jewish texts and rituals, and he disagreed with Orthodox Jews over their concerns for rituals and practices while neglecting the engagement of their heart and the will. He was close friends with Reinhard Niebuhr. He actually delivered Niebuhr's eulogy, and with Martin Luther King. The Kings had plans to celebrate the Seder with the Heschels on April 12, 1968, but of course King was killed on April 4th. Always there was the concern of Rabbi Heschel. His theme and concern was that the heart and soul of religious belief had to be revitalized for these modern times, or they would be lost. Lost to the habits of day-to-day living, as well as lost to the temptations of modern culture. Writing in 1955, how many years ago was that? Almost 80 years ago, he said, religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. So when faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with a voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. And Heschel did not want religion to become meaningless. He worried that mankind could destroy itself. It almost had in World War II. He was worried that it might destroy itself without an adequate sense of meaning. So in the 1960s, he felt compelled to come out of the study, to engage in civil rights movements. His religious perspectives forced him, drove him, necessitated his activism. He marched from Selma to Montgomery with Martin Luther King. He protested to the Vatican about the doctrine of conversion of the Jews. He supported George McGovern in 1972 because McGovern was opposing the Vietnam War. As he said, after Auschwitz and Hiroshima, religion could not, it must not remain an issue of concepts, something to be argued over, something abstract. For him, religion and religions had to become relevant again so that Auschwitz and Hiroshima could not be repeated. Religions had to re-examine the questions and the situations that made religions necessary. How do you re-examine the questions and situations that made religions necessary? According to Rabbi Heschel, religions were the responses to the awe and wonder that humans experience. Heschel believes that all religions share that common starting point. Mankind is small compared to something much greater, and that human understanding is therefore inadequate to appreciate all there is to reality. He declared that all religions stand against the view that humanity does not need guidance, that they can rely on its own powers, its skills, its reasons, its human will. The tragedy of Nazism, Heschel believed, lay not only in the murder of Jews, but in the elevation of human interest over, quote, reverence for life, the awe for truth, the loyalty to justice. Humans need a sense of transcendence. We need to feel we are part of something more important than our own interests. But that awareness also needs to be channeled by or channeled into something more than just selfish or tribal interests. And religion can also provide inspiration to people to help overcome. It has to help us overcome our tendencies for comfort, self-delusion, and indifference. After Auschwitz and Hiroshima, when religions that either justified the horrors or remained indifferent to them, Heschel was asking what needs to be changed. And I believe that if Heschel were alive today, he would still be asking those difficult spiritual questions and still be providing helpful spiritual perspectives on the tragedies of our times. Sandy Hook, George Floyd, January 6th, the Ukraine, immigration, climate change. The problems that we face are different, but the important questions to ask are still the same. His writings declare it's important to reacquaint ourselves with the questions to which religions are attempts at answers. These are foundational questions such as, what do we stand for? What do you stand for? What is evil? And how do we recognize and confront it, not only in others, but also in ourselves? How do we stay dedicated to caring for others? How do we stay dedicated to seeking the truth? How do we not callous ourselves to the catastrophes that surround us? Heschel believed in, and he lived, a sacred humanism. Secular humanism is not enough. The honoring of human nature and human beings, and only that, is not enough. Our being here and our living together, Rabbi Heschel says, must include the presence, the support, and understanding of the expectations of God. Ultimately, who is responsible for the problems we live with? And he would answer, we are responsible. For Rabbi Heschel, God is more than a ground of being. I think he actually said that is too vague, too gauzy. God has expectations of humans. God is creator and lawgiver, but God needs a partner. So humans must be responsible. There are three things that I think he believes, if you want to summarize. God created humans all equal in dignity. We are all created in the image of God. And that kind of is the amazing Jewish contribution to civilization. We are all created in the image of God. God cares about what humans do. His book, The Prophets, is 600 pages on how God is a God of pathos, a caring God, a subject, a personality, not a concept. And God has covenanted with the Jews to show the world how it is possible and how they should live together. But then God also needs humans to bring about his vision of heaven on earth. We'll come back to that. So let's now turn to this essay, The Meaning of the War. Of course, he's speaking of World War II. It's an example of Heschel's thinking about God and the role that God plays in human affairs. But more importantly, I think he's showing how there's an important role that humans play in God's affairs. God has expectations of humans. So the essay begins with that bold statement, emblazoned over the gates of the world in which we live is the escutcheon of the demons. I had to look up escutcheon, of course, the first time I read it. An escutcheon is a shield bearing a coat of arms. An escutcheon proclaims the identity and the loyalties of those living within the castle. Emblazoned over the gates of the world in which we live is the escutcheon of the demons. He then goes on to describe the distress and the confusion of living in a time so soaked with blood, 1943. Mankind asked then, and mankind asks now, with guilt and distress, agony and terror, as he says, who is responsible? And Heschel's answer is that we are responsible. We are all responsible. He says frequently and elsewhere, in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. In this piece, he quotes the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. If a man has beheld evil, he may know it was shown to him, in order that he learn his own guilt, for what is shown to him is also within him. And he tells that allegorical story of the mountain climbers who fall into a pit and then are confronted by swarms of angry snakes. As they fought off endless numbers of snakes, one climber was standing aside and not fighting the snakes. When he's asked why, he replied, "If we remain here, we shall be dead before the snakes. I'm searching for a way of escape from the pit for all of us." We can and we have to confront and try to kill the snakes, but the pit is also a problem. I think that Rabbi Heschel believes the pit is created by human blindness and hubris, human callousness and self-delusion. Mankind's fault, Heschel believes, is related to abandoning the awareness of God. cleverly, for man is free and he is very clever. Humans elevate their own accomplishments over those of God, while neglecting to acknowledge, of course, that our human gifts are originally God-given. Abandoning awareness of God, elevating human accomplishments, these, Rabbi Heschel says, have created the pit of snakes into which we have all fallen. For Heschel, quote, the outbreak of this war came as a long-expected sequel to a spiritual disaster. And he also warned, quote, the war will outlast the victory of arms if we fail to conquer the infamy of the soul, the indifference to crime when committed against others. He has said elsewhere, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. Too easily we can get used to evil. We lament our limitations, we secure our comforts and interests, we protect our tribes. We, quote, barter holiness for convenience, loyalty for success, love for power, wisdom for diplomas, prayer for sermon, tradition for fashion. In another Heschel quote, we should not spend our life hunting for trivial satisfactions while God is waiting constantly and keenly for our effort and devotion. The Almighty has not created a universe that we may have opportunities to satisfy our greed, envy, and ambition. Awareness of the divine can move humans to transcend our human shortcomings, and for Rabbi Heschel, that is the way out of the pit. I think I'll stop there shortly. Let me summarize before we move on to hearing how reading Rabbi Heschel might have affected you. Rabbi Heschel's worldview and spirituality are God-centered. He says at the end of the last line in his book about the prophets, there is no self-understanding without God understanding. He believes these qualities of God in relationship to mankind. As we said before, God created humans all equal in dignity. We are all created in the image of God. God cares about what humans do. God is a God of pathos, a subject, not a concept, a caring God. God had covenanted with the Jews to show the world the way we should live together. But God needs humans to bring about his vision of heaven on earth. Therefore, Heschel says, quote, the universe is done, the greater masterpiece, still undone, still in the process of being created, is history. For accomplishing his grand design, God needs the help of man. Life is clay, and righteousness, the mold in which God wants history to be shaped. The universe is done, the greater masterpiece still undone, still in the process of being created, is history. For accomplishing his grand design, God needs the help of man. Life is clay, and righteousness, the mold in which God wants history to be shaped. And that, I feel, is where we stand now, responsible for our small portion of shaping history in our lives, in this church and this community, in this nation and the world. We have big challenges, but recalling Rabbi Heschel might help us find and stay on our way. So I think I'll end there. Rather than have me elaborate more on Heschel, I would ask you now to comment on how his words might have affected you. How do they resonate with you? How do his words interact with your memories, your reason, your imagination, your intentions? How does he relate to our Christianity? And what lessons have we learned or failed to learn compared to 1943? What spiritual challenges does Rabbi Heschel raise up for our personal lives as well as our institutional lives? Thank you.
Okay. Oh,
No, I was planning to send this essay out, if that's okay with you guys, so that you can all
sure.
get the talk out. And if anyone's interested, well, I'll also send out the text of the Heschel essays from 3 years ago. So.
Oh, good.
All right.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say, I'll take questions, but my screen only shows 12 people and there are 15 of us. So if you can help me, if you see somebody raise a hand, I may not be able to see it. So just you can just call out. Who would like to start with a question or a reflection? Bob?
You got to unmute yourself, yes.
Right. I thought during this past week sometime you commented that this was about World War II and kind of implied limited to it. And I found reflections on all kinds of social issues. The big statement that, and have I just lost it now? Oh, some are guilty, but all are responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the extermination of the Jews that grew out of long times of anti-Semitism, and traces back the string of guilt. And but when I thought that this really kind of applies to so many social issues, it suddenly hit me, I think, yesterday. But there are too many social issues. There are too many huge issues. And how can we keep from being overwhelmed by this, especially for someone like me with ADHD that can't set priorities? I mean, it's easy to say set priorities, but how can you prioritize what's happening to the earth over what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening to racial injustice in our country? I mean, there are kind of forced choices. And then I got the answer in a way was, well, if we can just be supportive of others who are dealing with these various issues. And it seemed to me that our congregation has so many individuals who are involved with other parts of these social issues, so that if our congregation can support their work, then they're also supporting my conscience. And then I thought, well, it shouldn't be just limited to our congregation, but we ought to reach beyond that into the Presbyterian Church and these issues of, okay, I'm not going to come up with the right term, the ownership of the land.
Land acknowledgement.
Thank you. Yes, land acknowledgement. Right. That's it. So I've got a partial answer there, but not enough to free my guilt from being overwhelmed with petty concerns in light of all these issues, but still pressing petty concerns. And I better stop now. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Bob. I mean, I think we all share your sense that there are too many issues and we make so little difference. How do we stop Putin? Well, I don't think we can, but we have, another one of his in this essay, he was saying how evil is indivisible. There's a big evil. That it's on page, I think 211. Tanks and planes cannot redeem humanity. A man with a gun is like a beast without a gun. I like that one. The killing of snakes will save us for the moment, but not forever. The war will outlast the victory of arms if we fail to conquer the infamy of the soul, the indifference to crime when committed against others, for evil is indivisible. It is the same in thought and in speech, in private and in social life. So, we have a lifetime to work on our stuff, right? Our internal sources of, evil is, we all contain bits of evil. We have to have the courage and the fortitude to examine the sources and our misconceptions and our contributions. And also we have to work on the external sources. But I think that, well, it's and Heschel would say that we, it's important to pray, that prayer doesn't save us, but he says the prayer doesn't save us, but it makes us worth saving. Which is amazing.
Like that. David, what is evil is indivisible mean? I wasn't sure when I read it. I'm still not sure.
I think that, when you see I think that he recognizes that God has created humans in God's image, and he finds, I think his thesis is that it is our pursuit of human interests without regard to God's interests that creates evil. We have these appetites, we have these wishes to make ourselves safe at the expense of others. The lack of a communal sense. Every religion addresses these to some degree. The Buddhists would say that greed, hatred, and delusion are the sources of the three poisons that destroy our lives and our relationships. Other people have identified riches, status, and pride. Things that keep getting in our way of seeing that other people are also suffering, and that we are responsible for not passing on the suffering.
Boy, there's one right there, isn't it? That's something, in answer to what Bob was saying, that is one of the things we could do. Not just be compassionate, but not pass on the suffering as individuals, as a way of living.
I think go on.
I'm sorry.
That Mallory McMurrow YouTube thing that about when she was speaking up in Michigan, and she's saying that our kids, we're not responsible for slavery, but we're responsible doing something, mitigating the impact of that going forward.
Right. Yeah. Other questions, reflections, Susan?
One of the things I wrote down that you said, Dave, that Heschel believes that the heart and soul need to be revitalized. And I couldn't agree more. I keep wondering if that happened across the world, within our church, within Christendom, within creation, everywhere, that would be a big step to some of these visions and aspirations. How is that? Does he talk about how that can happen? You said he thought believes prayer is, that's kind of where I am right now. I feel like I get so overwhelmed by everything. And I wonder, how in the world can my heart and soul be revitalized? Now, it is in nature. It is with music. There are things that nourish my soul and heart, but I wondered if he wrote about or spoke about how this can happen in humanity.
That's tricky. He does. He says several times in this. He doesn't mention that word here, but later he talks about callousness. He certainly talks about indifference here as being a real hindrance. But callousness, he writes about that as, something that is protective. Is at one level we protect ourselves by becoming calloused to the suffering in others. But he actually doesn't give a very good plan on how do you overcome that. It's a tricky issue. It's that he's not a good amateur psychologist. In fact, back in the 1950s, there was this, basically a movement trying to explain religion, explain spirituality as a cultural phenomenon, as an outgrowth of our psychology. And he very forcefully says, no, our spirituality is a separate, dimension. It is much more than just our psychology. It's not part of our biology. And I think that, we've now had another 80 years, 70 years of progress in the sciences, the social sciences, neurobiology. And I think that the conversation about what is essential to our, there is something that is a little beyond just psychology and biology. And that conversation doesn't occur. But part of this is encouraging ourselves to identify within ourselves what it means to have a soul. What does it mean to, and then to kind of also open the conversation so that others will, will examine themselves. It's a pretty magical thing, and it's part of the magic is that it's not explainable by, you can't make a computer have a soul. We are programmed to be social beings, and something about us, I don't know. And the other comment I would make is that, our genetics makes us so darn unique, incredibly unique. So I think that probably that also means that we've also been created with a very unique soul. And your answer, my answer, your perception, my perception are probably not the same. And I had a little story. I'll tell something. It'll be in the text version. The story about how before God created man, he buried truth, and there is no way for humans to discover truth.
Oh my gosh.
Nancy.
I had the statements that you read about his perspective on faith, I thought were very interesting. And I wrote down faith replaced by creed. And I don't know what the whole statement was, but I know the session is being asked to think about what we believe as Presbyterians. And it scares me a bit that it's leaning toward dogma.
Me too.
And I'm uneasy with this. And so I guess my ears pricked up when I heard that about faith replaced by creed.
Me too, Nancy. I felt exactly. I thought, oh, there's some words that I will use when we talk about that, because I feel the same, that and I love the fact that it brings it back to faith, not exactly what you believe, which is creed.
Anybody else have it? Ed has a reply. You're
I
muted.
hear you.
You're still muted, Ed. You're muted.
Yeah, not a reply to the answer, but just adding to the concern. It has been one of mine as well for, as you probably gathered from my comments last week. There is a quote, David, that you had that I thought is very relevant to this. And if I have it right, religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid. And then when faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. I would add that when it speaks in the name of authority rather than the voice of compassion, I think I would add something to the effect that it needs to become a part of our soul. We need to be able to live out of it.
Right.
And so when religion provides that for our life, as we experience and as we give our life, that's really the contribution. If it doesn't do that, if religion doesn't provide that aid, if you will, then we're really missing. It just becomes a habit, another habit of ours. It's not really something that's made a part of us.
No, it's this question, especially since there are so many competing religions these days, how can any religion provide a correct answer if there are so many, incredible faith traditions that people are dying over? How can any one of them be right? And that term about how religion had become irrelevant. That is the third page of this whole book on God in Search of Man, and it leads that's his kind of exploration of how do you rediscover the questions, it is. He doesn't have the answers, but he doesn't want us to imagine that we have the answers just because we have a sense of faith. The whole definition of faith. There's an interesting book called by Fowler. I'll send that to you, but it's so many of us, I think, before we start. Our spiritual development ends at in Sunday school. It's a Sunday school religion. Sunday school faith is a little bit primitive for the needs of the world. We don't end up with arithmetic and cursive writing. So we stop developing our faith though at the third grade level sometimes, maybe sixth grade, maybe 15. But adult education and adult spirituality is, it continues and can develop further, and that's something that is often not discussed and certainly not modeled very well. And that's another way we could contribute, I think.
Is the Fowler book The Ages and Stages of Faith?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So it's by the time, if you can develop a sense that you are part of something more universal than just your faith tradition, then there might be some grounds for, all the great religions talk about our interconnectedness, right? They all talk about our interconnectedness.
Yep.
So it's I think I started working on this talk today because because of the war in Ukraine, and it is frightening, isn't it? How the issues that Heschel was describing in 43 are kind of being, we're facing again, or still in 2022. It's so what are the parallels? What do you think? He's not. So much of what we do is a matter of killing snakes. We're not doing a good job of getting ourselves out of the pit. So how do we see how sending arms to Ukraine is a matter of killing snakes, not a matter of getting ourselves out of the pit.
But sending arms to Ukraine is also about standing up. I forget how he says that we need to confront evil. I do think it's that, and we have not always done that.
Right.
And we are trying to do that. And I think one of the hardest things personally for me with the Ukraine is that it's easy to numb out and not want to see the images, not want to let in the suffering, because it's hard to do that on a day-to-day basis.
Yep.
And I've been trying really hard in my meditation time each morning to try to put my attention to doing that, to letting in the suffering, to taking in and letting in the suffering, because there's, at least in me, and I think in many of us, there's such a strong denial and wanting to numb out from the suffering. And it's hard to keep your heart open.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about, what is it? He says heart and what was the other thing? Heart and soul. Yeah.
Okay.
Other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ed?
Ed?
Yeah.
I've also been struck by, we are amongst us here and in other churches with similar people of concern, spend a great deal of time thinking about this subject. I'm also struck by the number of our population who give no thought to this at all, or who are led into directions by charisma of some particular leader and think then they are somehow people of faith. And I don't want to be so arrogant to say that they don't have faith, but I am struck by the fact that what we are doing dates back many thousands of years, probably to the Reformation. And we speak of reforming, ever reforming, but we're not reforming that much. And we need to give some thought to that. I'm not sure how, but it is, I think that's what Heschel is saying when he says religion, when it becomes oppressive, insipid, and so on, isn't reaching people. People are just, they don't see the relevance. And I have concern about that. It does affect the way we make our decisions as a society, and the values that guide this country appear to be significantly eroded in our politics today. So I think Heschel has much to say on that area.
My reflection is that there's, the need for spiritual belonging, the need for purpose and meaning, the need for explanations. I kind of alluded to this in the other talk. This guy, Paul Chappell, actually heard him in downtown. He was brought there by the Judy's. You're nodding your head.
I know all these people.
It was brought by the the Buddhist center there. But he's a peace activist, and he has this great little essay. If you want to look it up online, it's called A New Peace Paradigm. But he identifies that we all have these spiritual needs for purpose and meaning, for nurturing relationships, for explanations, for a sense of belonging. But when it's not articulated and is not encouraged and is not practiced, I think we kind of fall into these habits of belonging and explanation, and we get sloppy in our understanding. And so when you used to have mainline religions, and people went to church, you would at least hear and encounter this. But there's so few people going to church that even this topic isn't even raised anymore, and it's almost is not woke anymore to bring it up. Is not allowed to bring it up because it's been kind of denigrated by this a common mythology. Heschel also, of course, he's you read Heschel and then you see Heschel everywhere. It's my problem is that I got a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. But it has we are being confronted by another ecumenical movement that's worldwide, and that's nihilism. People feel that there is no meaning, there's no sense, there's no purpose. It's all accident of nature that we're doing this. It's all culture. It's all whatever else that we happen to have encountered. There's no sense of something behind. And that's Heschel saying that, we can, there is a God. He wants to say, wake up. Don't just imagine that we're just the tools of our circumstances. There is something beyond. And just because, God is not making himself, herself, themselves visible easily, doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. Another of his magical terms is that, when it's not that God is absent, we're not looking for him. We're not looking for God. And whenever you do look for God, you find him in some sense. You find God turning toward you when you do look. And we have to keep reminding ourselves that that's a fact. So,
and that it takes attention. It doesn't just happen. You have to.
yeah.
That's the role of humans. And that's the way out of the pit, right?
That's what he was saying.
In Heschel's mind.
Yeah, and I think, it's, yes, that's part of the pit. That's the way out of the pit, is to remind ourselves that we are created in the image of God. Yes, we are. But I mean, it's not a kind of a Buddhist way of, we're all connected. There is, he has a much more personalized God. There is a God that is not just a ground of being. This is a God that has expectations. And that's a hard thing to accept in this day and age. I mean, it's kind of much more convenient to say, oh, we just happen to be here. This is the way that evolution has created us. Oh well. But yes, if you start thinking that there's a purpose, and his very challenging quote, who's responsible? We're responsible. We are responsible for this piece of history that we can take care of. And yes,
God has given us the responsibility.
Yeah, and that he would say is a that basic American concept that all men are created equal, right? He would say that is not something that comes from nowhere. That is not, yes, it's Christian, but before it's Christian, it was Jewish. You don't find that in Greco-Roman mythology. You don't find that in Buddhist and Hindu theologies. You find it a little bit in Confucian, but it's not, we all have a dignity that we're born with. That's a crazy thought, isn't it? And is so ingrained in us that we've forgotten where it might have come from. But his analysis is that this is something the prophets gave us, and it's just underlies the whole Old Testament that our dignity comes not from our own being, but from a gift.
We've just got a few minutes left. Bob?
I do struggle with your last comment, Dave, in that some of the things we do are not biologically motivated, or that's your suggestion, I think. And during your talk, you said something to the effect that what typified mankind is tyranny, or adherence to tyranny. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I have to go dig that up here.
Well, anyhow, I guess what I struggle with is that Heschel, I think the way you portray him does not represent or does not describe the mankind that I am overwhelmed with, that I see every day. I have a very, very difficult time with that. I don't know if Heschel would agree with me or anybody would agree with me, but as I progress through life and examine the world and observe the world around us, I just basically see a fundamental constant struggle between good and evil.
Mhm.
Am I oversimplifying Heschel when I say that? Is that something that he would agree with?
Well, I think that he's not going to deny that that evil exists. He would, and I would bring Paul Chappelle into this again. He would say that, when you see a distorted spirituality, you need to look for trauma behind it. And that goes back to, I think, everything that the Buddhists say about looking for suffering. If you look for the suffering in others, I think you start to recognize that distorts spirituality. That if you're, I think built into us is this incredible need to have an explanation. And if you got screwed up somewhere, any explanation is better than no explanation. The freedom to decide for yourself is a very painful freedom, and is sometimes much easier to give up that freedom to somebody else who has the answers. Because then you don't have to look at your own responsibility and your own guilt and your own freedom. That's a very hard, and people can fault the culture. They say, everything should be easy. We should always we should have the right to be happy, not the pursuit of happiness, but we should have a right to be happy. And Heschel would also say that, that challenge, one of the greatest gifts to humans is the ability to have challenge, because it's only through challenge that you grow. But if that challenge is traumatizing, then that is going to be stultifying, not growth promoting. So I think that, and the other thing that I guess I would throw out there, and I do talk too much, the Abrahamic religions, the other thing that they contribute is, it's not just the Buddhists, I think, will talk about how you need to identify and to work with your own suffering and to overcome that. But the Christian and the Jewish and the Muslim faiths would say that there is a role, there's a God of justice out here. There's a God of justice. And that is a matter of how, I think that what someone has said is that, then our role becomes how do we limit, how do we fight against suffering that is produced by institutions? Because that's what injustice is, right? Is the fact that the forces that form us are also unjust. The ideas that, and how do we identify that? I think that's a conversation that we also don't participate in much. So if you try to combine looking inside through prayer and through meditation and contemplation and all, we also have to recall that there's a role for us at also looking at the external forces that create the injustices, because that is also creating the suffering for others. And when we talk about bodhisattvas who don't go on to release but come back to help bring the message to help others, that is a matter of coming back to help relieve the institutional suffering, and so, as some people say. So you can't just escape into your own world. There's a role for us here. Ed?
Well, I realize this is a little off subject, but I shared with you in your first Heschel speech that when I was at Columbia,
Yeah, I know. I
my
remember.
wife got a invitation for somebody to do some typing, and she was a very good typist, and she didn't mind. But what she got to do was work for Rabbi Heschel. And I don't know, some of the things we were reading, maybe she was typing for him, but
Yeah.
His interest was in my name, which is Semitic background, Sefer, and it is spelled differently in different IR, ERs, and so on. But she was really quite. I think what I remember about that was that she found this man very interesting, and now we can see why. But I never met him, but she worked for him a number of times.
I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. As usual, we've had a very, very deep discussion, and appreciate all the work you've done, David, towards leading us here. And thank you to all those who contributed, because this feels like part of our faith journey. And part of doing what David talked about, which is looking at what does God expect of us, and how can we live our lives more up to God's expectations. I sort of like this concept of God having expectations of me. It's a new one. So anyway, thank you so much, David.
Okay.
We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Corey, you're going to have to end the meeting for us here.